Ladies and gentlemen, let's game into the video. Naughty Dog have unveiled a bucket load of information regarding the PlayStation 4's architecture and SINFO, so we're going to be doing an analysis and technical breakdown of this and actually going into exactly what they mean by some of the stuff. An overwhelming amount of you guys actually messaged me, and despite the fact that I am still somewhat sick, I'm going to try to do this in the best manner possible. Now, I've also done this as an article, and I would super duper recommend that you check the article out, because there are multiple references in this and technical diagrams, and I've actually already done some articles regarding certain parts of this stuff before, and so I've listed those so you can check those out. And I've also linked to various white papers from AMD, programming books and stuff, and so on and so forth. It's quite a lot of research in this, so I can't really just tell you guys verbally. A lot of this you're going to have to kind of read and do a little bit of checking if you want more technical information. Do be aware that this is going to be quite technical, although I am going to try and break it down as much as possible for all of you, which does mean that maybe some of you are going to kind of know some of this stuff to begin with, but we're certainly going to start hitting the technical bat in just a very short period of time. So I'm going to do a very brief overview of the PS4's technical specifications. I have done much more in the article, which you can check out. It's also got links to, for example, what CISC and RISC is, more on the PS4's compute structure, and much more if you want to check out the relevant links in the article. But I'm going to go a very brief overview, just to act as kind of a refresher for all of us. So, the PS4, of course, is the sequel to the PS3. And although the two architectures can appear wildly different, they're actually in many ways very similar. We'll go into why in just a moment. But the main CPU of the PS4 is an X86-64 CISC AMD Jaguar. And the 64-bit, by the way, means that it can address greater than 4 GB of memory. It's 64-bit, in other words. And as for the CISC versus RISC, it's a very, very long tail, and I've linked to it in the article, so I'd recommend you just check that out, because I'm going to spend 5 or 10 minutes just discussing that alone. There are 8 cores total, and it has been definitely confirmed that only 6 are available for the game's developers. And those 8 cores are split over 2 modules. Now, as it turns out, there is quite an important significance on the fact that there are 2 modules, and we'll get into why later on. We're still unsure about the PS4's clock speed, but estimates are probably around the 1.75 GHz, around what the Xbox One is clocked at a pure guess. Next up, of course, we have the GPU, which is based on AMD's GCN, also known as Graphics Core Next architecture. Now, it's actually very similar to the Radeon 7000 series, but there have been definite improvements on the compute structure, so it's much more like, say, the volcanic islands. I've done more information on that, as I said in the article. So it's running at 800 MHz with 1152 stream processors. Each of those stream processors, by the way, is clumped into 64 units, which means you get 18 CUs, which are compute units. So if you do a little bit of mathematics on this, and I know everyone loves maths, especially me in my ravaged state currently, but if you take 1152 times that by 800, and then you times that by 2, you actually get the 1.84 teraflops of computing power. Simply put, that's 1152 shaders times 800 megahertz times 2, because each shader can do 2 instructions per clock. Pretty simple maths. As I've said, there are some definite improvements to the compute structure of the PS4, primarily that it has 8 ACEs, and each of those can handle 8 queues each. So all of the ACEs basically are pretty much organizers. They organize what runs when on each of the shaders. Now, this is very important considering that the GPU handles both rendering and GPGPU, which basically means general purpose computing on the graphics card. To you and I, that means basically AI, physics, cloth simulation, fluids, blah-de-blah-de-blah. As I've said, there is a link in the article which goes into more. I'm just emphasizing that to you guys because I know otherwise I'm going to get questions regarding it, and I don't want that, but I also don't want to keep covering ground that I've already covered because it's very boring to everyone else. Finally, we're going to very briefly go over the PS4's memory. as an overview anyway. So the PS4's GDDR5 memory, which of course seems to be the main point over the Xbox One, considering the Xbox One, of course, is using DDR3 with ESRAM. In the PS4's case, it's running at 5500 MHz. That's 1375 MHz actual, but you basically have to times the actual clock speed by times 4 just because of how GDDR5 memory works. Therefore, you get 5500 MHz on a 256-bit memory bus. So, if you do a little bit of mathematics on that, that's 176 gigabytes of memory bandwidth. You can also calculate that if you so desire. You take 5500, you times that by 256, and then you divide that by 8. So that would be 5500 megahertz times 256-bit bus, divide by 8 because of the way the bits into bytes work. Now, there was some debate regarding GDDR5 memory having longer latency times compared to DDR3, but I actually put out an article before the PS4 was released, and in which I actually did quite a lot of research comparing DDR3 to GDDR5, and basically proved that this isn't the case. Once again, the link is in the article. Okay. So now that we're all caught up and we know the basics, let's discuss more concerning the PS4's memory. So there are several definite pieces of information we've come across. Now, memory has always been a really limiting factor for consoles. If you're a PC gamer that goes, PC programmer that goes into consoles, particularly if you are one who produces AAA games, you're going to find yourself strangled for memory. And despite the fact that the PS4 does have quite a lot of memory, it's still an issue. And this is according even to Naughty Dog's Jason Gregory, who of course is the chap who did this discussion and talk. And he's, in his own words, PC memory is basically limitless because you've got virtual memory and, well, PCs now have so much RAM. Just a basic bog standard gaming PC now usually has at least 4 gigs plus the graphics card memory, which is usually 1 to 2 gigs. But that's like low end. Most systems now have at least 8 gigs on the main end, on the main memory. Plus you've got usually a 2 gigabyte graphics card, but generally speaking, it's even more than that. Gaming PCs now are starting to go to like 3 gigabytes on just the graphics card memory, and then you've got like 16 gigabytes for like main system. So it's really starting to become to the point where like PCs don't really have to worry too much about RAM. This isn't the same about consoles, of course. Now, in his own words, the PS4 has about 5 gigabytes of memory available for games developers. Why only so little? When just a few minutes ago I was rattling on the specifications and I mentioned it had 8. Well, you'd be forgiven to forget that the PS4 does have operating system overheads, which isn't anything new. The Xbox One has them, the PS3 has them. With the PS4, it's quite a technical read, but Sony have mentioned the flexible memory before. However, I'm going to go with what Naughty Dog is saying here, and they are stating about 5 gigs of memory is available for games developers. This may or may not change in the future. Now, it's incredibly important that you understand memory allocation and memory fragmentation, and we're going to discuss this a little bit in just, well, actually now. So, memory defragmentation is incredibly important for the purposes of performance. Basically speaking, great and stringent memory management is what's going to separate your program from running like crap to running pretty damn well. Now, you don't really want to rely on the general purpose memory allocators, which by the way are standard part of the C++ programming library. Incidentally, the programming library, the programming language, which is C++, is used for most PlayStation 4 games. Indeed, PSSL, which is the PlayStation shader language. If you want more information on the PlayStation shader language, you can check it out on the channel. I've got a video which is part 1 regarding the PlayStation shaded language. You can just search for PSSL or PlayStation shaded language if you want more information on that. But more to the point, it's all coded in C++. And in C++ there are standard libraries that you can call upon. These are basically pre-written instructions and functions. This basically saves you from having to do it yourself. However, they're not particularly the best way to go if you're looking to do like high-level optimization. And so, generally speaking, it's better to just do your own allocations regarding this. Now, what's very important to realize is that memory becomes fragmented. Now, if you're a person who uses a PC for any length of time, chances are you've run memory defragmentation. If you have, you might be aware, or you might have seen how memory kind of storage on your hard drive is kind of divided into blocks, right? Now, what's very important to realize is that every single asset in the game, and I emphasize this crucially, every single bloody asset in the game actually is a part or represents something in the game world, and therefore must appear in memory. Now, of course, not all assets are created equally. This is very important to understand. So, for example, if I have a bullet casing from a gun, it's not necessarily going to be the same amount of memory as, a big sodding mech that's stomping around the level trying to, shoot me in the face. On the other hand, you might have large buildings, destructive environments, physics, speech, graphics, character animations, God knows what else. Pretty much everything has to go in memory. So in other words, even the game knowing that you can stand on the ground and run around lovingly on the ground without floating into space or disappearing through the floor, all of that is coded in memory. And so each of those requires a little house, a little place to live in memory. And this is where it's really important for memory defragmentation. Because basically what happens, there are illustrations in the article, but basically what happens is that let's assume that you have blocks A, B, C, D, and E. And let's assume that each of those memory blocks is the size of the number 2, right? And let's assume, so A is equals to 2, B equals 2, C equals 2, D equals 2, right? And let's assume that you want to remove B. You no longer need B. B's done. He's finished with the world. He's done his job. He's deleted. Okay, so B is no longer there, but you still need B, right? So you need to re-reference B in memory. So what you need to basically do, okay, well, I'm going to put B back in. Okay, but I don't want B to no longer be 2. I want B to be 3. So you still want A to be 2, C to be 2, D to be 2, but you want B no longer to be 2, you want it to be 3. What happens? Well, if its memory's not defragmented properly, pretty much it won't fit, and it can cause stalling. Because what's basically going to happen is the memory's trying to fit into a location that it doesn't quite fit into, and this is where memory defragmentation comes in. Now, I'm vastly simplifying it, but I don't really want to go super into that, because unless you're really interested in programming, you're not really going to understand much more than the basic concepts anyway, most likely. What I might do is ask James on the channel, also known as The Kid, who's doing currently a programming course, to maybe go over memory defragmentation in a separate thing, so you guys have more of an idea if you really do want to know about it. So anyway, moving on. If you notice in the article, or just generally speaking, development kits typically have more memory than the retail units. This isn't for any other reason other than to simply make it easier for games developers. It's for debugging. So let's assume, for example, they want to create an animation of a character walking. Okay, that fits in memory. But let's assume that they now want to take that animation and, oh crap, the character's just tripped on a pebble, right? So that's going to require a bit more memory. So what they need to do, they might not want to reallocate various pieces of memory, they might want to do optimizations, they might just want to say, is this a fun mechanic? Does this work? Does it look cool? You know, does it screw anything up with the rest of the animation? So rather than having to decompile the game or having to recompile a whole new thing, trying to do optimizations, they might just want to do a very quick, dirty piece of animation, dirty piece of code that is absolutely horrible, it's copied and pasted to shit, but it just does the job. Now, the purpose behind this extra memory is that it gives them that ability. They can basically put that little bit of information into the memory, and they don't need to really worry about any constraints. If it works, if everything works great, then they can then optimize it and implement it into the real game. This is why that they label everything. Hence, you've got global VRAM, debug VRAM, and these are incredibly important to remember because global isn't the same thing as debug global. Debug global simply means that it's part of the debugger and therefore isn't going to be available, is not going to fit if you're trying to put it into a retail machine. It's also worth remembering that Gorilla also really pushed their own defragmentation technologies. They were using GPU compute, which of course we will go into in a very short amount of time. And they also pushed it into labeling all of their various pieces of memory, all of their jobs very, very well. So what about multi-core processing? Right, we've discussed the PS4's memory, so let's move on to the multi-core environment. So to understand the PS4, I think it's a great idea to understand the PS3 because the PS3 actually gives us a lot of solid information. So the PS3, I have done articles regarding the PS3 before, and I've got a link to one in the article as you'd expect regarding how the PS3's cell processor really works. But suffice to say, there's a PPU, which is a power processing unit, and an SPU, which is a synergistic processing unit. If you really want to know the technical ins and outs, as I said, you can check the article, but if you don't want to know it too in-depth, it's a pretty simple prospect. The PPU has got 2 cores, and it can handle a couple of threads, whereas the SPU, they're basically very fast CPUs with their own little chunk of memory. So there are 6 of these SPEs, and sorry, did I say SPEs? I meant SPUs, but regardless, there are 6 of them, and they're labeled from 0 to 5, 0 being the first one, unintuitively. And the purpose here is that you have a main thread, you can consider it like the orchestrator, the worker thread, whatever the hell you want to call it, and it basically kicks a job. So in other words, a job will be kicked from one thread to another thread. So let's assume that you need a thread to calculate what is 1 plus 1. So the PPU will kick that to the first SPU. Let's say SPU 0, so that can be job 1. Then you need to do the same thing. Let's say you want to calculate 2 plus 2. Well, you might want to kick that to SPU 2, the first SPU, SPU 1. So you'll kick that over. And let's assume that you keep doing that all the way down to SPU 5. But let's assume in this, ridiculously obscure, calculation we've got going, that 1 plus 1, which of course is running on SPU 0, is taking a long time to process, right? It's a very complicated piece of work to calculate 1 plus 1, don't you know? And so it requires a bit of time. So obviously, each job requires a different amount of time. So for example, in this case, 1 plus 1 might require a different amount of time to calculate, say, 2 plus 2, just for example. So what would happen is that the main thread would start to schedule, it would then put another job. So let's assume that we're up to job, let's just make it easy and say job 1 is on SPU 1, SPU 0. So the first SPU has job 1, whereas the last SPU had job 6, right? Because we've got 6 available. Okay, great, understood. So then what would happen is that the main thread would schedule job 6 on SPU on the first SPU, but in reality it doesn't work like this. In reality, because each of the jobs is a different length, is a different size of calculation, it could be anywhere. So you don't know, for example, job 6 could fall on the first SPU, or SPU 2, for example, could have already finished its job, and therefore job 6 goes to SPU 2, and so on. I hope that you guys get an idea of this. As I said, this is why I've done it as an article as well, because if I was to try and illustrate this in a video, it would drive me absolutely insane. It's sometimes just easier to use diagrams and stuff. So anyway, this is why this is very important, because if it's not, if you don't have jobs well scheduled, if you've got, say, wait times in there, what you're going to end up happening, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have like breaks. And the idea is to have a very minimal amount of time between each of the jobs. So let's assume that you have, let's just use a magical land where you've only got SPU 0. There's no other SPUs. SPUs 1 through 5 don't exist. All you've got is SPU 0. And all you've got is PPU 1 scheduling to SPU 0. So PPU is telling SPU what to do, right? It's a one-to-one relationship. Let's assume that that was the case. The idea is that it would actually it would be very easy for it to schedule the jobs, wouldn't it? Because each job would be sequential. But in reality, you've got multiple SPUs, and therefore the main thread has to actually dictate, okay, well, SPU 2 has a few, has very little going on right now, or look, this job's just about to finish. So you might have a situation where in exactly the same amount of time, let's say 1 second, SPU 0 has handled, say, 4 jobs, whereas on the other hand, SPU 3 has handled 7 jobs, whereas on the other hand, SPU 5 has handled only 1 job, just for example. So that's that. Now, in the case of the AMD Jaguar, things are quite a little bit different. There are multiple reasons behind this, but effectively speaking, the AMD Jaguars are known as out-of-order execution CPUs, and they have advanced branch prediction. Now, this might sound a lot of gobbledygook, but it's actually pretty simple to understand. With the PS3's CPU, which, as I've mentioned, with the cell processor, which is based on the PowerPC, it was an in-order processor, which meant that if you had a section of code that popped up and it wasn't expecting it, it would stall while a different piece of information was loaded, pretty much. In this case, it's not. What basically happens is it's out of order, so it can load data in any way possible, but because of the advanced branch prediction, it's much better at guessing, which is pretty much what it does, which piece of code is next to load. So in other words, it can logically go through a series of codes and it'll be like, okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and it could basically guess that it has to now load 5, 6, 7, and 8. It could basically guess this so it can optimize the code much more efficiently. This is much more effective and efficient, and it means that it can load this into the CPU's cache or registers while it's still processing other pieces of data. Now, as we're going to discuss in the next video, most likely, because it's already getting fairly lengthy, there is a significant performance penalty from loading a piece of data from the PS4's memory, or even from a different core, from a different module, compared to loading it from, say, a local level 2, or even better, like a level 1, or let's say the CPU register. And that's just about it for this particular video. I'd like to make it lengthier, but I've already been discussing this for almost 25 minutes, and as I said, I'm still not exactly 100%, so I'm going to have to take a short break and kind of rest my throat for a little bit, but I'm going to be finishing off the first part of the article as well. In the next part, we're going to be looking at GPU computing on the PS4, we're going to be looking at memory, caching, and general performance on the machine, and of course, further taking a look at the PS4's job system. So anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the first part. I'll see you soon, take care, and bye for now.